Hi, all. Thank you for listening to my sermon. This is on 1 Samuel 17. So, my husband, Cole, and I just got a puppy. Her name is Lucy. She's a Bernedoodle. We're obsessed with her. But what's been fun as we have taken on this new dog parenthood kind of life is that we've really enjoyed getting to train Lucy. We have found just how malleable she is. We have been able to teach her how to sit and lay down and heel, all of the classic dog things. But I've delighted in teaching her how to dance, where I get her to spin clockwise when I wave a treat above her head. We are training Lucy how to exist as a dog in this world. But we do the same with our kids, right? We tell them stories to help them learn how to exist as a child of God here on earth. Now, one of our favorite stories that I know I learned as a kid and hope to share with my kids is the story of David and Goliath. We teach them about God's power and how God can work through even a shepherd boy with just a stone and a sling to defeat a massive giant. And while this story trains our kids to take on a life as God's child, I have found, as I've considered this story for us this morning, that this has a lot to do with training us for adulthood too. So, with all that in mind, I want to read for us this morning the story of David and Goliath. And I want to encourage y'all, adults, to listen with fresh ears to this age-old story. Listen for how the power of God may speak to you in your day-to-day life today. So King David, for context, he's one of the most recorded characters in the Bible next to Jesus. King David is nowhere near perfect if you read more of his life, but his life is one of extremes. He vacillated from extreme faithfulness to extreme self-centeredness, from being a blessing to a kingdom to setting a domino effect of destruction on the people he loved most. The stories of David put on display the human condition and show us who God is to us as we experience life's extremes. The story of David's encounter with the insurmountable opponent, Goliath, is no exception to these extremes. So though you have likely heard this story, I invite you to listen with fresh ears as I tell the age-old story of David and Goliath. So here's the story in my words. After Saul had been failing to remain faithful as a king, God inspired Samuel, the prophet, to anoint the person who would take the throne next. Unexpectedly, God had Samuel choose a shepherd boy. He was the youngest and the smallest of his family. This is David. David inspired the quote, "God looks at the heart," which is one that we love, right? But what does this say about David? Well, he didn't look like he fit the role as a king. And this makes sense when we think about who David was at the time. Because of his birth order, being the youngest, David was relegated to a role of servitude. He was left to tend the sheep, a laborious and dirty job. At times, David was asked to play his lyre for the king, though to the king, David remained nameless and faceless, just a servant. But David knew in his heart that God gave him, though he was the youngest son and nameless, faceless servant, he knew in his heart that he carried the call to lead and protect an entire nation. So the story goes that the Israelites were in a precarious spot with a nation of people called the Philistines. They were at war. Both nations were on a hill, so you can imagine that there was this valley in between, and they stood at a standstill. The Philistines initiated a battle by sending forward an insurmountable warrior. They proposed that each nation would send a warrior to represent themselves. And it's no wonder that they chose this method of war, because the Philistines had this absolutely ridiculous warrior named Goliath. This Goliath had the entire Israelite army shaking in their boots. So who is this warrior that had an entire army completely afraid? A while back, for our middle school ministry, we studied this story together, and I wanted to find an image to help capture how large Goliath was. So I did a little math to do a little comparison to one of the girthiest celebrities that I could think of. And I was trying to think of someone who our students could relate to and know who I was talking about. So I found Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. I compared Goliath to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and this is what I found. Dwayne is 6 feet 2 inches and 262 pounds. Now, imagine he just came out with the new movie called Black Adam. If you don't know if you've seen that, but he's been in tons of films. Think of whichever film you can relate to most or imagine the most. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is a big dude. Now, we're gonna imagine Goliath. To Dwayne's 6 feet 2 inches, Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. That doesn't mean anything to us. Apparently, that is 9 feet and 600 pounds. 600 pounds. And if I had my slide with us, we'd see just how great of a difference this was. This is a large man. But the brawn of this man was not the only reason this man was so formidable. The text goes on to explain how the Philistines decked him with the most lavish armor. I imagine that if the ancient world could illustrate the most formidable warrior, they would write about Goliath. Goliath was a breathing caricature of the world's most formidable opponent at the time. So that's Goliath. 9 feet, 600 pounds. This man was a behemoth. But David, think about David. David was meant to be tending the sheep at the time. Small shepherd boy. But his dad sent him on a mission to bring cheese to his brothers, which I delight in. I think that's a great note. He was on a mission to bring cheese to his brothers. As he was visiting his brothers in their campsite, he overheard threats bellowed by Goliath. As Goliath was shouting out insults, the Israelite army was mumbling about the reward King Saul offered for whoever would take on the Philistine warrior. David was intrigued. Interestingly, the reward for taking on Goliath by the king was wealth, a reprieve from taxes, and the hand of Saul's daughter in marriage. So, not only was the giant barking out threats of David's beloved God, but slaying the giant would allow David to be one step closer to the throne. And this was the very place that he knew God was calling him to. Remember, the most important part of this story, I think, is when we remember that God chose a shepherd boy to be king. And he was anointed, but then he goes back to his normal life. All the while, he's holding with him this call to be the king of Israel. And so, practically speaking, he's probably wondering, well, how is that going to happen? But he knew that God called him to be that. And then, lo and behold, he's delivering cheese to his brothers, and he finds out that all it would take to be one step closer to the throne would be to take on this giant. It was perhaps a perfect, ordained opportunity for David to begin to assume the call that God placed on his life. So David's wheels are turning. As he started to process this opportunity that he has in front of him, take on this behemoth giant Goliath, who's spewing out threats of my God, or potentially take on this opportunity to take hold of the call that God has placed in my life. He's processing these things. But right as he's processing, Eliab interjects. Eliab is David's older brother. And he comes down, he says, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. So as David begins to dream, immediately his older brother sows doubt. Have you guys ever experienced someone do this? Have you ever had, whether it be big or small, someone sort of throw a wet towel onto your dreams? Right as you find yourself with enthusiasm saying, what if someone squashes your excitement? It's how I imagine this moment to be. David's dreaming, then all of a sudden his brother comes in and squashes his excitement. But the discouragement sown for David, it wasn't just by anyone. It was from his brother. I don't know about y'all, but my siblings, my family's opinions weighs heavily on me. And it wasn't just a doubt, but it was a character assault. So for David to follow through with the task of taking on Goliath, he had to reconcile the dissonance of disobeying and disappointing his oldest brother. Takes a lot. But he does. David does. Instead of listening to his brother and going back to the sheep and his dad, he becomes publicly outraged that the Philistinian opponent, Goliath, was defying our living king. When David's outrage reached King Saul, David was brought before the king. And David, the youngest, smallest son, a nameless servant, stood before the king and confidently assured him that he was equipped to fight the opponent. But once again, David was faced with opposition and doubt. The king said, "You are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior since birth." But David gave the king assurance. And with what assurance, you might ask, being a shepherd boy? David used examples that he had seen by being a shepherd. He said to the king himself, he says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. The uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of a lion and the paw of a bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Amen to that. Let's go, David. So the king agreed to that. And then here is where we meet the crescendo of the story that we all know and love, with the sentiment of who is this uncircumcised Philistine who should defy the armies of my living God. David approached the opponent without any fancy gear, but with a few simple tools. He took his staff in his hand, chose a few smooth stones from the stream, put them in a pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. And despite the opponent being dramatically bigger and stronger and well-equipped, David defeated the opponent with just a sling and a rock. This is the story of David and Goliath. Cool. Well, what stood out to me as I read this story afresh, especially thinking about us adults taking on the story, what stood out to me was David's bold, unashamed, and even dangerous commitment to God's call in his life. He had numerous opportunities to say no. His own brother called him names. The king himself doubted him, and the giant was reason in and of itself to say no to this opportunity. And no one was even asking him to take on the giant. He wasn't backing down from anything. David saw an opportunity to take hold of the call in his life. And with the courage that only God's faithfulness brings, he boldly rose to the occasion. Why? Y'all, I think it's because David recognized the weight, the importance of God's call in his life. David didn't take lightly the fact that the God who spoke the world into being asked him to join his team. David didn't forget that he was anointed for a task. And y'all, this is who God is. This is who our God is. God invites us along in his journey for restoring what has been broken in this world. In Psalm 139, David himself reminds us that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. That God himself crafted us, he knit us together. We are each made with intention. And in his first letter to the church in Corinth, Paul talks about how there are many parts to Christ's body, each with an important task. He writes, "Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you a part of it. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing and helping and guidance, and of different kinds of tongues." We are all made differently, but we are all, each and every one of us, we are part of Christ's body, and we are all given a role. And throughout the Bible, we read of God calling and using people for his good in this world. And y'all, we can look around us. We can witness God calling people for his mission, God's redemptive work in this world. We can look and see Maya and the important work that God's called her to in Ukraine. We can look to Christy and Sunny and Claire and see how God has gifted them for sharing the gospel to kids, the call that God has placed in their lives. We can look to Danny and see a passion and heart for community outreach and see that God has placed a call in his life for God's good mission for redemption in this world. Y'all, God invites us to join his mission. This is who our God is. So my question for you is, where are you called? What gifts and talents have you been given? And as I speak those words, if you're thinking to yourself, I haven't been given a gift or talent, or I don't know where I've been called, let me remind you that David did not look the part. He was the youngest, the smallest brother. He was the nameless, the faceless servant. By all accounts, David was not the guy to assume the role as king. And he certainly was not the guy to take on Goliath. I imagine when Samuel anointed David, David was like, who, me? So I'll ask again, what opportunities has God placed before you? Well, David had not fought a 900-pound man before he faced Goliath. God did give him training grounds. When David faced the opposition of the king, his assurance was found in the faithfulness of God, which he had seen over and over again as a shepherd. He said, I know God will be faithful because he's rescued me from the dangers of lions and bears. Some of you may relate more to David's training grounds. Maybe you're not sure. You need to spend more time figuring out where God's called you, and you're not facing that perfect opportunity right now. You're not facing a giant right now. But what would it look like for you to keep your eyes open to God's faithfulness here and now? David didn't know he was going to face a giant one day, but when he did, he was confident and he was assured because he could point to the work of God in his life in the past. Others of you are currently facing your Goliath. You're in a position where the rubber of your faith is meeting the road. Your faith is being tested. Maybe because you took on God's call in your life, or maybe it's some challenge outside of that, a circumstance or event. Maybe right now you need to be reminded of God's faithfulness in the past. Whether you are in the training grounds or being called right here and right now to step up to a call God has placed in your life, be encouraged by this story. David took a bold step of faith, trusting God. He knew God placed an important call in his life, the call to imitate God's kingship. When David took the opportunity he saw in front of him, he saw God move in power. Let me say that again. When David took the opportunity he saw in front of him, he got to see God move in power. Y'all, David shouldn't have won that battle. He should not have won that battle. Goliath, 600-pound man, 9 feet tall, little David. He shouldn't have won the battle. He shouldn't have. The story gave us every indication that David took on an impossible task. But y'all, God moved in power. And we can trust that God will move in power in our lives as well. To finish the story, David's defeat of Goliath was the beginning of his eventual campaign to the king. He received all the perks of defeating the giant, a bunch of money, marrying the king's daughter, and many began to follow him after he defeated the giant. And while David's future story has many downfalls, twists, and turns, we see God move in power as David took a step of faith. So, whether you are in the training grounds right now and just looking out to see how God's faithful around you right now, or if God has placed an opportunity in front of you to take hold of your call, the call in your life, let us be encouraged by David's story. Be reminded that God will move in power in your life. And let us be inspired to step up to the calls God has placed in each and every one of our lives. Thank you, and let me pray.